Good evening, all, and welcome. My name is Sophia, and I'm the past president of Woodsworth College Alumni Association. This evening with me, I have Alex and Nita, fellow directors of WICA, and Maina, the current president of WICA. It is with great pleasure and honor that we welcome all of you to our last Alumni Café of 2024. And over to Maina for a land acknowledgement, please.
I have to unmute. Thank you, Sophia. Just for land acknowledgement. Although this is an online event and we are not at Woodsworth College grounds, we are here as a community within the University of Toronto. So we would like to commence by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huon-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Torto Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on this land.
Thank you, Maina. So some housekeeping matters before we start. This lecture is being recorded, and you can watch the recording on Woodsworth College's YouTube channel in the coming days. The technical team has enabled live captioning. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can enable that with the CC button. A Q&A session will follow the lecture, so please submit your questions into the Q&A box throughout the lecture, and one of our directors will read the questions to Jennifer when the lecture starts. And at the conclusion of the lecture and the event, there will be a post-event survey that will pop up on your Zoom screen. So please take a few moments to answer questions. We would really appreciate your feedback. Now on to the fun stuff. As many of you know, the Alumni Café is our Alumni Association's flagship event, through which we strive to provide a platform for a stimulating discussion that features our speakers' research and expertise and resonates with our diverse alumni. For this year's College's Pick, we are very excited to hear a lecture from Professor Jennifer DeSilva titled Women, Sex Work, and Taverns, the Digital Humanities in Renaissance Florence. Jennifer DeSilva earned her PhD in history from the University of Toronto and specializes in cultural and social history. Prior to returning to Toronto, she taught at Ball State University and Eastern Connecticut State University from 2007 to 2023. She has edited several collections of essays on issues of space and religious reform, on the Borgia family, and on the papal possesso with Pascal Rouet. Jennifer DeSilva also co-edits the 16th Century Journal. She has published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and chapters related to identity, reform, festive studies, vice activity, and the scholarship of teaching and learning. She is also the author of the Office of Ceremonies and Advancement in Curial Rome, 1466 to 1528. On behalf of WICA and all of our alumni, congratulations to Jennifer DeSilva for her recent appointment as Vice President of Woodsworth College. We are so honored to have you among us and very eager to hear your lecture. So Professor DeSilva, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Sophia. That was a very kind introduction, and thank you all for joining me tonight. I hope that we're going to learn something interesting and have a little bit of fun as we go. So today, instead of a traditional research presentation, I'm going to offer a bit of a hybrid discussion. So one that reflects my role at sorry, I'm just figuring out how to use the buttons. One that reflects my role at Woodsworth College as a teacher scholar. And as you might know, that in addition to being the new vice principal, I also teach in the Digital Humanities program here at Woodsworth and in the Renaissance Studies program over at Victoria College. So today I'm going to bring those two programs together in my talk. So specifically, I'm going to show you one aspect of my research that uses the digital humanities to teach analytical skills and knowledge of early modern Florence. So by early modern, we're thinking of the time period roughly from 1400 to 1700 CE. So there will also be some questions in the chat as we go along. So you'll find them in blue on my slides. And here's the first one. For all of you out there, what do you think the digital humanities is? So what does it sound like? When I say that I work in the digital humanities minor, what do you think students do in that minor? So please put your suggestions in the webinar chat, and we'll see what people think. So think about the title. The digital humanities involves what sort of ideas? What have we got here? Yeah, okay. So Jesse Grimstead says it's a blend of traditional humanities, interpreting texts, modern tech add-ins. Yeah, exactly. Carla DeMarco, yes. So interacting with artifacts and information in the past, but using traditional humanities questions and applying over them a digital format or presenting them in a digital format. So what you often find, oh, and great answers, what you often find is that digital humanists are taking very traditional questions, collecting, as Isabella said, digital archives, and presenting them in new ways. So digital humanities strives to see more in our sources. So this might mean that they create an archive or a data set of information. And they use that to map using GIS, Geographic Information System data, or they present a web-based reading analysis. It might be a networking structure showing how varying people or texts are connected. And often we use a lot of visualization tools as well. So there are a lot of ways into digital humanities. And one of the things that is often discussed through using digital humanities tools is social geography. So what does that sound like? So what is social geography? And of course, that's going to be sort of core to what we talk about tonight. So again, it's one of those questions where the hint is really in the phrase. What does social geography sound like? Okay. So how geography shapes society? That's right, Alexander. So geography, of course, appears in a variety of different ways. So yes, mapping relationships between communities, Isabella said. Yeah, so it could be how people inhabit space, how social factors influence their presence or their distribution. Yes, that's right, Irene. So geographic zones for certain groups of people, and you will definitely see some of that tonight. Their distribution or the distribution of their activities over a physical area. Okay, so just before we get into my research proper, I want to say a note about sources. And I know that we're not here for a class tonight, but you might remember from history class that to get to the past, to get as close as possible to the people from the past, you have to get close to the things that they left behind, so the traces that they leave. And primary sources are what we're going to look at tonight. And that's what you see here on the screen. So a primary source is something from the time period that we're investigating. It might be a text, might be an image, an object. If we're thinking about a more modern time period, that would be perhaps audio footage or film footage or an archived website. But the primary source that we're going to use tonight is this image. It's an engraving made by Bartolomeo Grassi. And it's a great way to start thinking about sex workers and taverns. So Bartolomeo Grassi included this engraving in his catalog published in 1580. And it was entitled "Of the True Portraits of Dress of All Parts of the World." So we should look at these three women and think about what they're wearing and how they are portrayed. So Grassi sent messages in all of his engravings. And we have three women here, and each one bears a title. So forgive my language for just a moment. I'm going to translate the titles. And we're moving from left to right here. We have La Putana Plebea. So this is the common whore. In the middle, we have Nobile Putana Veneziana. This is the noble Venetian whore. And then on the right-hand side, we have the Ruffiana Veneziana, the Venetian procuress. So to understand this image, you need to know that in the 1400s, the 1500s, and the 1600s, sex work was legal and regulated in many Italian cities. So Venice in particular was known as a city for sex tourism. And therefore, the three women that we see on the screen here are working women. All right, so our third question for the chat. So what strikes you about these figures? How are they similar and how are they different? What do you see in them? And what might we need to know in order to think about legal sex workers in this time period? What does Bartolomeo Grassi want us to think? So let's take a look at the chat and see what people have to say. What is similar? What is different? And what strikes you about these women? Okay, so Michael Gibson says that, yes, they define the profession, absolutely. And Irene, you're absolutely right. So we have very interesting wealth and status levels here. Although there is quite a bit of similarity between our common and noble sex workers. If you look closely, you can see a little bit of variation in the sleeves of the noble sex worker. Yes, definitely, John. So the attire signals social hierarchy. We have far more elaborate aristocratic garments, yes, on the noble sex worker. She has a lovely larger jewel chain that I think is attached to her veil. And of course, a veil is an indication of a more exalted status. And she has a very interesting long girdle that stretches down. So yes, all of these are great answers. And you're right, there is a certain similarity between our noble and our common woman. Posture is very different for all three. That's right, Jesse. And the older woman is covered up to a great extent. We should think about the fact that she is not showing any of her body here. Okay. And yes, we could think about the noble sex worker as being more akin to a courtesan. Absolutely. So more money spent on her to hire her. And of course, a client who is higher up the social hierarchy. Definitely. Good question, Victor. Okay. And yes, so Bronwyn suggests that the exposed leg indicates lower status. Yeah. So our common sex worker is showing off a little bit of what you can purchase access to. Shall we put it like that? Okay. So in the early modern imagination, so this image was designed to show us three things. So first, we have the career paths for poor women who had no other skills or who had no other choice than to sell access to their bodies. Okay. The second thing that Bartolomeo Grassi wants us to see is that this is the life cycle of a sex worker. So the young women with good posture and flawless skin become, after several years or perhaps several decades in this profession, old and bent, and they move away from selling access to their own body to selling access to somebody else's body. And thirdly, there is undeniably in this engraving a moral judgment. So sex work might have been legal and it might have been regulated in Italian cities like Venice and Rome and Florence, but it was still it was still shameful. The procuress's external decay, so her bent back, the wrinkles on her face, So it reflects an internal decay that over the years of working in this shameful profession had really corrupted her exterior, corrupted her body. And we should think, following this train of thought, that the young women, beautiful and straight-backed, even in very elaborate clothing, that because they are working in this profession, they have an internal decay that over time will be seen on their exterior. All right, so how did I get here? Well, my research on early modern Italian sex workers began with teaching social history, which is a lot of fun. I wanted to find a way for students to get closer to people in the past, not kings and queens necessarily, although they are a lot of fun too, but regular people who didn't leave a lot of records of their lives. Sources usually are left behind by people who are wealthier and more literate. So the search for sources, primary sources about the past, regular people in the past, led me to this, the Decima Project. So it's a digital humanities project. It's online and it's open access, so you too can explore it. If you copy and paste or you type in the blue URL on the screen, you can go and wander around in the Decima Project. And it maps census data to position households and businesses as they were in the past. So you can actually, or you can metaphorically, walk down the street in Renaissance Florence. And this is really social geography, right? So you can think about the relationships between contemporaries by examining tax census data that is mapped onto a map from 1584. So the project was created by Professors Nicholas Terpstra and Colin Rose, originally both at U of T. Professor Rose is at Florence University, and it's grown to be a leader in its field. So the Decima Project offered a crucial set of primary sources for thinking about the regular Florence through their tax census information. And it provides 3 census data sets, one from 1551, one from 1561, and one from 1632, as well as a commercial census. So there's a lot of information there. You can see who lived in buildings on the street. You can compare their rent or their property values and the size of their households. So the examples that I show you today are all going to use screenshots. I'm not actually going to be moving through the Decima Project, but you can. So I do encourage you to go and wander around there. And if you're not really up to finding out how many Giovannis there were in Florence in 1561 or how many shoemakers, you can just look at the project gallery. This has some really interesting and beautifully presented work on a variety of topics, from Florentine art to noise control, to the Jewish ghetto, and of course, the plague. No project is complete without a mention of the plague, right? All right. So this really is digital humanities at its finest. It's a terrific source for students, for researchers, and the public, and it is meant for the public to enjoy. And it answers great questions about the past. And it's become the basis of many of my collaborations with students. So I'm going to show you 2 projects that I worked on with students that draws on the 1561 Florentine census information. Now, bit of a surprise for you all. I've asked 3 people in the audience to help me out. And could I please call on our first volunteer to read the text that they have been given?
In 1561, L'Orsolina Bolognese was a registered sex worker called a meretrice. She came from Bologna, north of Florence. She paid 13.5 scudi in annual rent for her home at the corner of Via Palazzuolo and Via de Canacci in the Florentine quarter of Santa Maria Novella. She rented the home that she shared with another woman from Camilla Pistolese, who lived at Santa Elisabetta delle Convertite, the convent for retired sex workers.
Thank you, Alexander. That was very well done. You have excellent Italian pronunciation. All right, so we're starting with L'Orsolina. which means the little she-bear in English. It's very evocative, the little she-bear from Bologna, the first university city, just north of Florence. And we're starting with Orsolina because she offers everything that one needs to get hooked on working with census data and the digital humanities. So we have a lot of biographic information, some economic information, and of course, geographic information with a dash of sex thrown in. So all of the information that you just heard came from the brief 1561 census entry, and you can see where she lived on the screen here. So her household is in the Santa Maria Novella quarter. It's number 267, and she lived there on the corner. So if you have ever taken the train to Florence, you were probably no more than 7 or 9 minutes walk from Orsolina's house. The central train station is just a hop, skip, and a jump from the Church of Santa Maria Novella, which you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen. And Orsolina's house was one of 9,000 households enumerated in 1561 by Duke Cosimo I of Florence. Conveniently, the census offers information about the household head's name, so this is Orsolina, the household head's gender, their profession, and sometimes marital status, though usually only women are designated with marital status, and usually it is when they're widowed. So we're sometimes told their husband's name, but widowhood seems to be extremely important to these people. And perhaps that tells us about his concerns. Now, when I first started using the Decima project to teach social history about a decade ago, it was pretty amazing that we could see people in the past, centuries ago and so far. And of course, thinking about the people who lived there and their neighbors was really exciting. The first assignments that I gave to students were exercises in charting social ties and neighborhood amenities, real social geography sort of stuff. So students would create likely social networks for a handful of household heads, not Medici or Strozzi patricians, but weavers and widows, nuns, fishermen, bakers, and of course, our sex worker, Orsolina. The students then applied ideas about urban life that we discussed during class. And they found the bakeries and the groceries where their people would go every day for food, the parish churches that they would visit. And using a commercial census from the same year, we could track all of those places, the bakeries, the groceries. We could question whether they would have enough money to buy meat from the butcher and where they might get a drink at the local tavern, or where they might have a tooth pulled from the barber surgeon. And of course, students would map their people and their person's social network on a map just like the one that you see here. So what we found was that our discussions again and again came back to a study of class and professions. So two really important aspects of social geography, which are intimately connected with the early modern world. So what you do quite often plays a part in where you live. So this was the beginning of working with the Decima project. And since then, I've developed much more complex investigations to ask more questions about urban life in the 1500s. So now let's turn to talk about more recent research that I've done with students. Could I please ask volunteer number 2 to read the text that they have?
Yes, that is me. Alex is a tough act to follow, so please give me grace. In 1561, on the Via del Limbo, 2 laundresses shared a house owned by the wealthy John Figliazzi family. Mona Benedetta and Mona Sandra paid 3 lire and 7 scudi, respectively, in annual rent. Next door lived Pasquina Fiorentina, a registered sex worker. Around the corner on Via del Purgatorio were 3 more sex worker households.
Well done, Sophia. I think that Alexander has someone hot on his heels for excellent Italian accent. So once again, that information comes from the 1561 census via the Decima Project. And just before we move on to talk about this project that I did with students, I want to say something about the rents. I think living in Toronto or Southern Ontario, or really wherever you are, we're all very cognizant of the cost of living and especially rent. And as you can see, Mona Benedetta and Mona Sandra pay very different rents. So they live in the same building, but there are two households in that building. Mona Benedetta pays 3 lire, which is a small coin, and Mona Sandra pays 7 scudi, which is a much larger coin. So it was about 7 lire to the scudi. So Mona Sandra pays about 49 lire in rent, and this is annual rent, which tells us that either Mona Benedetta has a much, much smaller apartment, or someone is subsidizing her rent, someone in the Gianfiliazzi family. Who can say? But that's something to think about, in addition to the fact that we have somehow stumbled into the Dante Alighieri neighborhood, but more on that soon. So female-headed households really stand out in the census. And these are households that are run by women. They do not have a man or a patriarch completing the census interview. So these households tend to be poorer, smaller, and further away from the urban center. There's been a lot of research about contemporary, so early modern Italian fears that a poor woman heading a household without a father, a husband, or even a brother to care and provide for them would somehow go astray. And by astray, become a sex worker. The contemporaries worried about this a lot because there was a huge market for sex. Many early modern men married later, or they did not marry at all. And this was chiefly because they worked in low-wage industries like weaving. Most men never became guild masters, which would indicate a certain higher level of income. And many unmarried men lived together in rented accommodation, or an unmarried brother might live with his married brother, sister-in-law, and their children. Now, to assuage these fears, Florence passed laws separating sex workers from other households by creating buffer zones, so areas in which no sex workers were allowed to live. So from the 1400s through the mid-1500s, these buffer zones shrank. Might seem strange considering all of these fears that continued into the 1500s, but they did. And what we see is that Florentine sex workers move from being outside of the city and not allowed to come into the city except on particular days, to being quite close to the women that Florentines worried about. The Florentine government did this knowingly because they needed to tax sex workers, and so they wanted to encourage their business. And they needed the tax funds to fund the convent that Alexander told us about. So Santa Elisabetta delle Convertite, the convent for retired sex workers. So our sex workers moved into the city proper. By 1547, sex workers were expected to live within the city, but only on 18 streets. Or they could pay a fee to live wherever they wanted. Now, it was a big fee, but nevertheless, so those were their two options. And census records allow us to think more concretely both about groups like sex workers or widows or female household heads, and also about the individuals within those groups. So with a couple of graduate students, Catherine Curtin Johnson and Brandon Whitsitt, we compared the location of female-headed households and the location of sex worker households using the Florence census. Right, so before I tell you what we found, I want you to take a look at this map. So this is the Decima project, zoomed out really, really far. And you can see that the map has been pieced together. There are nine pages or plates in the map. And what I've done is traced the 18 streets in red where sex workers were permitted to live. Okay, so my question for you is, were sex workers living solely on permitted streets? So the sex worker households are the purple dots. Okay, so please tell me in the chat, were sex workers living solely on permitted streets, or are they living wherever they want? What do you think? Michael Gibson says, I bet not. Michael, you are correct. So we can see that the purple dots are all over the map. Sophia says that it's not far in some cases from permitted streets. You're right. So there are some streets in which there are a lot of sex workers and they are doing what they are supposed to. But Rahim is right. It is definitely a mix. It is absolutely a mix. So I should say at this point that there were 3 options for sex workers. They could pay the fee to live wherever they wanted. They could live on those 18 permitted streets, or they could just take their chances and hope that nobody noticed. And there was definitely a group that took that 3rd option. All right, so now let's return to our laundresses living on Via del Limbo. So the image that you see on the screen now is from an article that I wrote with Kathy and Brandon about their research. And we found that there were areas across Florence where low-income women lived next door to sex workers. And of course, this was exactly what Florentines feared. Poor women in high effort but very low wage industries like laundry might consider turning to sex work to make more money in less time. And if they were living next to sex workers and they had questions about how to do this, Florentines feared that their neighbors would give them advice or even procure clients for them. So what you see here is that figure with the streets highlighted. So all 3 streets that you see here that I've highlighted have sex worker households on them. You just can't see them on the Via dell'Inferno because it's off the screen. But also these streets and the houses or the buildings on them are not so spacious that people who live next door to each other would not know what the other person was doing. Okay, so all 3 streets house sex workers, but only Via dell'Inferno is a permitted zone. So on Via dell'Inferno, we have several all-male households, a tavern, which you see there shaded blue, where sex workers and potential clients could meet to eat, drink, and chat. On Via del Limbo, which is where Mona Benedetta and Mona Sandra live, I've coded it magenta. It is not a permitted zone, but we do have the sex worker Pasquina Fiorentina living there. And just around the corner, so quite tightly packed on a short street, the Canto del Purgatorio, as I said, definitely a Dante theme going on here. There were 3 more sex worker households, and undoubtedly Mona Benedetta and Sandra were their neighbors. Yeah. So it's possible that some of these women tried to fly under the radar since they were comparatively far from a permitted zone, permitted street. So this is what a lack of strict enforcement looks like. So a lack of strict enforcement of the residential requirement. Sex workers living next door to the women that the laws claimed to protect. But in addition to this, in 1561, buffer zones were meant to separate sex workers from another population. So from the people who worked in churches or who lived in monasteries and convents. So here's a question for the chat. Why would the city want a buffer zone between sex workers and churches, monasteries, and convents? What's the reason for that? We don't necessarily have people saying mass in churches 24 hours a day, but sex workers worked from their homes. So while people are typing into the chat, I'm going to talk a little bit about the map that you see on the screen. So this is an egregious example of letting enforcement and buffer zones go. what we noticed is that some sex worker permitted streets led directly to churches and convents. And you can see this in the green lines that lead to a square in front of the convent church of Sant'Ambrogio. So the square, or the piazza, in front of the church was itself a permitted zone, as were 4 of the 5 streets that led to it. Okay, so Alexander says, so perhaps the priests would not be tempted. That is a valid suggestion, absolutely. Jesse says that they probably wanted taxes from the sex workers, but also wanted to limit civil unrest amongst conservative religious populations, perhaps, yeah. But also, as Naomi points out, limiting noise and bad influence. You got it. So bad influence, the phrase is malavicinanza. It's right there. So bad neighborliness, or bad karma, we would say. So also, there's a little bit more to it here. Definitely the nuns. So thinking about the convents. The noise of sex workers and their clients was notorious. So the talking, the laughing, the singing, sometimes the screaming, the fights, this was all called baccano in Italian, so racket in English, we would say. And of course, the noise from sex as well. All of this was distracting for neighbors in Florence, who often complained, and there were a lot of fines for sex workers who were simply too loud, or their clients, or people who were just standing in the streets swearing at them. But for men and women who had vowed to give up the worldly life of sex and singing and being out on the streets for prayer within a convent or monastery's walls, this could be the reminder of a lost life, and quite disturbing. And yes, we wanted to, or Florence wanted to, prevent people from trying to break their vows or leave the convent. So also, Florence's population of nuns was very large. And some women had taken vows to please their parents and other family members, rather than out of a true vocation to the church. So keeping them away from noise was very important to the city fathers, and also to the nuns' fathers, who quite often served in public office. So I should also note, as we're moving through the slides, you might see some QR codes that, if you're interested in any of the research that I'm talking about, particularly the story maps projects that my students created. And story maps projects are very colorful. There are a lot of images and maps and a lot less text than, say, an academic journal article. You can access their story maps projects by clicking on the QR code with your cell phone or a tablet. So your camera will just see the QR code and it will go from there. And of course, they're all publicly accessible, so you're welcome to look further. All right. So this project with Kathy and Brandon led smoothly into a second set of projects with undergraduate students in the Renaissance Studies program here at U of T. And in this course that I taught in winter 2024, it was the Renaissance in the city. And in order to narrow down the city, or urban studies, which is a huge topic, we decided to focus on taverns in particular, and workers related to taverns as well. So there were 3 strands to the projects that this class completed, and I'm only going to talk about one of those projects. So the 3 strands go like this. Firstly, researchers on Florentine taverns have argued that they were exclusively male spaces, okay? And the tavern keeper was an important male figure in the community. There were no women in taverns, either as clients or workers, no women at all. But given how many taverns there were in Florence in 1561, so there were 48 taverns, or taverns within inns in 1561, and how important taverns were for buying food to eat in or take out, we were a little bit suspicious of this idea that there were no women working anywhere there. So that was one strand of our research. The second strand was about those working women. So outside the Italian peninsula, women were most likely to run taverns and inns. They were thought of as sort of an expansion of domestic work that women might have completed. So opening up the home, this is hospitality, it's just on a larger scale. And in particularly in England, in France, in the American colonies, and in what becomes the Netherlands, women were routinely managing inns and taverns. So in Venice and Rome, there's a long history of women running inns and rental accommodation. So working women was the second strand that we were interested in. And finally, the third one was about judicial records. So historians who work with criminal records have already shown that some Florentine taverns were sites of sex work, both heterosexual and homosexual sex work. But if there were no women in taverns, how is this possible? So those were our three strands. And in response to the historians that we read, we asked, what relationships were there between the tavern keeper and the people in his household who might be female tavern staff and the sex workers who might have come in for a drink or might have come into the tavern to meet potential clients. And some of these sex workers were living in the taverns that were part of inns. So that was our question. Let's figure out what we found. Now, I should say, before we move on to the research that my students did, I want to take a look at the image on the screen a bit closer. So here we go. I've just shifted it over a little bit. And this is another primary source from the time period under investigation. This woodcut it was published by the architect Sebastiano Serlio in 1584, and it is meant to be a sample stage set for a comedy, so a comedic play. So it was designed and published by Serlio. And in the text that goes along with it in his book, he tells us what these various houses or these various buildings should be populated by. So he's telling you a little bit about how the scenery connects to any typical comedy plays that they might want to put on. So Serlio tells us that the yellow, or I should say that the building that I've highlighted in yellow on the ground floor, that is a tavern space. Okay, so we can sort of see what it would have looked like, or a stereotype of one. And on the left-hand side, the area that I have highlighted in pink, Serlio tells us it is a procuress's house. And we know this for certain because Serlio has inscribed RVF on the wall. And RVF is short for Rufiana. So this is a procuress's house, so a go-between. Someone who connects potential clients with sex workers and brings them together. All right, so Serlio is suggesting that there was a connection between taverns and sex workers, certainly on the stage, so in drama, but perhaps also in real life. So how do we go about proving this? That's what my students wanted to know. And the answer, as they quickly found out, wasn't just using the decima, it was using more and different sources. Okay, and they found that was my answer for many things. We need more sources. We need to think about how our questions can take us in different directions. So we used a second census from Florence. This is not through the Decima Project. This is the 1427 Catasto census. We used criminal magistrate records and records from the magistrates that regulated sex work. And finally, we used tavern keeper guild records. Let me just take a drink of water. So I should say that the work that you're going to look at now was completed by two undergraduate students, Samuel Didone and Diane you and I created another sort of maps project. And again, you can use a QR code to investigate it. It's really quite interesting. So the Detchima Project's 1561 census was of less use to us because it did not list any female tavern keepers as household heads. And remember, the census only lists the name of household heads. And it did not tell us if male tavern keepers were married. It only listed the number of men and women in households. So we can see that in a pie chart here. So 67% of the tavern keeper households in Florence in 1561 included women, but none of those were household heads. Another 24% of tavern keeper households might have included women, but it's hard to know because they were multi-household buildings. And enumerators only provided the male-female numbers for the whole building. But this does tell us the likelihood that Florentine tavern keepers had wives or daughters in their household who they might have encouraged to work in the family business, as we see in other Italian cities and outside of the Italian peninsula. But to get a bit more information, we turn to that 1427 census. So it told us that there were 49 tavern keeper households in Florence in 1427, and that 40 out of those 49 tavern keepers were married. So this is 81.6%. That's a high number. So 81.6% of the tavern keepers in 1427 Florence were married. I hope they were very happy. Now, the same census tells us the size of those 49 households. Larger households, perhaps, were made up of relatives or servants, and larger households tell us that more people might have been available to work in the tavern alongside the tavern keeper. We also found that as the household grew, so did the likelihood that the tavern keeper was married. In households of 5 to 8 people, and this is 1/3 of all households, the tavern keeper was always married. In households of 3 or 4 people, 41% of all the households, it's an 85% proportion of tavern keepers who were married. So a lot of tavern keepers are married in 1427. So this tax census gave us some useful information. It was good context, but we really needed to see women working in taverns in the mid-16th century. So where did we turn? Well, strangely, no historians had looked at guild records when discussing female tavern workers. The State Archive in Florence houses the guild records documenting the regulation of tavern and innkeepers, but they also share a guild with tailors and secondhand dealers, linen sellers, wine sellers, and very strangely, poultry dealers. What we found using these guild records was still a partial view of the past, mostly because guild masters, so the members of that guild, tended to be male. A majority that I found in Florence covering the period from 1536 to 1601 identified over 3,000 people who joined the guild in that period. About 11% of this group matriculated as innkeepers or tavern keepers. And out of this group, there were only 28 women. So 28 women, but still 28 women that previously historians had said had never worked in taverns. So this was a win. What we concluded was that a few women had inherited guild membership from their father, their husband, or their brother, sometimes even from their mother. And that those women ran their tavern or inn, but quite often they passed their guild membership on to a male relative. And this was often because men were accorded full voting guild rights, whereas women were not, even if they were guild members. So the presence of these 28 women tell us that businesses often stayed in the family from one generation to another. And these women probably continued to work in the tavern or the inn alongside their son or their brother or their new husband, as they had worked in the tavern previously. All right, so at this point, we still were looking for more women. Couldn't just be 28 across 48 taverns. So we turned to criminal records to answer more questions about women who identified themselves as working in taverns. All right, so this is our last volunteer. Could I please call on volunteer number 3 to read the text that they were given?
Okay. There we go. In 1565, Maddalena, the widow of a tavern keeper in Via San Gallo, Piero, an innkeeper in Piazza del Grano behind the Uffizi, and Matteo, another innkeeper there, were prosecuted for collecting girls and prostituting them.
Thank you so much, Mena. Okay, so this is very different from the previous information that we had heard. And this comes from unpublished Florentine criminal records. These records tell us when something went wrong related to taverns. And there were quite a few things going wrong, it turned out. We certainly found more women who identified as tavern and innkeepers, or who were related to tavern and innkeepers, like Maddalena here, the widow. Often in the criminal records, they were charged with swearing or calling sex workers names, effectively causing a ruckus or a racket in the streets or in a tavern, or procuring women to work as sex workers in the taverns that they were running. So this was very interesting. So we also found more women like Maddalena, who were daughters and widows of tavern keepers. Tells us, right? Another example is Verdiana, the daughter of Andrea, the tavern keeper, who was a sex worker in 1561. There was no record of her father, Andrea, either living with her or heading his own household as a tavern keeper. And because we were able to find his wife, Caterina, at least we think it's his wife, a decade earlier, we think that Andrea was long dead by the time that Verdiana became a sex worker. Records from the magistracy that regulated sex work in this time period also identified the widows of tavern keepers working as procuresses. In 1569, there were 4 registered procuresses who would be the go-between between sex workers and potential clients. One was Monna Margherita, the daughter of Piero, the tavern keeper. She lived on the Via dei Pentolini. And the same list that identifies her identifies 7 sex workers living on that street, the Via dei Pentolini. So they were her neighbors, very convenient. One of those women was Cecia, another daughter of a man named Piero, the tavern keeper. So we think that Cecia and Maddalena worked together. They were probably sisters, and the procuress helped her sex worker sister and then profited from the income that she brought in. So to determine if this was common, we went back. So if tavern keeper, daughters, widows, relatives, this was common, seeing them in the sex worker world, we went back to the magistrates that regulated sex work. And we looked for a continuous run of records that would represent a reliable slice of Florentine life. So the graph that you see here on the screen shows that there were 23 convictions between 1593 and 1601 that involved men and women in taverns, so things happening in taverns, or who were tavern staff. And you see that the orange bars are the women who were convicted and the blue bars are the men. So all 4 of the people who were convicted as procuresses were women. One was an innkeeper, another was the widow of a tavern keeper like Maddalena, and 2 more were procuresses at a tavern called the Buco. Another woman in the sample was convicted for being an unlicensed sex worker, and she was identified as actually living at an inn. That was where she plied her trade. So in contrast to these women who were heavily involved in the labor of sex work, the men who were convicted, it was all because of violent acts against female sex workers. So all the convicted, or I should say all the convicted men, and who were 50% of the men that you see here on the screen, either physically assaulted a sex worker or they created a racket outside her house and a noise complaint resulted. But the other half of the men in this sample were male tavern keepers who often appeared as guarantors of the fine. So a guy in the tavern who they've known for ages was fined, needed someone to stand surety for his fine, and the tavern keeper agreed to do it. So what does all of this tell us? So what we see in the 1590s supported what we found snatches of in earlier decades. And it brings us back to these three strands, these three ideas that we began this project with. So tavern keepers were indeed link men in the community, and taverns could definitely be violent places with sex work. There were definitely women working in Florence's taverns and inns, just as there were in other cities and in other places. Working women were in these taverns. They were not exclusively male spaces. And sometimes they participated in sex work or in procuring, much as contemporaries feared. So I hope that this presentation has showed how the digital humanities and Renaissance studies can come together in an entertaining and data-rich way. Thank you for joining me today. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Professor DeSilva. Honestly, what an amazingly interesting topic you have here. We thank you for sharing your expertise and your research. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's got like 6 tabs open already with all the QR codes that you've shared, just ready to dig into it. So with that, we are going to open up our Q&A session. We'll just give it a minute for folks to start sending any questions that they may have, and we'll kick it off. So
actually, I see that Rahim has a question in the chat. Could I answer that while we're waiting?
Yes. Why don't we?
Okay. All right. So Rahim asked about whether married women included women living as common law partners. Yes. How to explain that though? So marriage could be a lot more less ceremonial. That's probably a good way to put it in the time period that we're discussing. It isn't until the Council of Trent, so really in the 1560s, roundabout this point, says all marriages must be documented by a priest and occur in a Catholic church. And of course, Florence is Catholic, as is the entire Italian peninsula at this time. But it takes a long time for all future married couples to actually follow suit and have their marriages effectively certified in a church. Prior to that, it would be a notarial document or just showing the community that, hey, so-and-so agreed to marry me, and now we are living together, and this is our marriage. You all know this, you see us, therefore we're married. Consent was everything, and actually consent was all you needed. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. In the chat, we have a question. I believe it's from Germaine. If there was such a fear about the proliferation of sex work, why was sex work regulated, i.e. accepted in the first place? Was there a sort of political divide in the city between proponents of sex work and people who were against it?
That is a good question. So I should say it isn't just in the Italian peninsula that sex work is legal. There were through the late 1300s and definitely into the 1400s, quite a few cities in Western Europe. And they tended to be larger. So Florence is a fairly substantial city, having between 40 and 60,000 people through the 14 and 1500s. These cities set up public brothels as well as licensing sex workers to live out of or to work out of their homes through the 1400s. And it's in order to organize this profession, we really should think about it as a way to regulate licensing, or sorry, to regulate a field that could quite easily go awry, and to profit from the license fees. So Florence actually has quite a high license fee. It's 15 lire for a 3-month license. And remember that 15 lire versus Mona Benedetta's annual rent of 3 lire. So there was, according to the Florentine city fathers or politicians, great amounts of money to be made out of sex work, even if, no, they did not approve of it. But money has to come from somewhere. And so if you license it, you can tax it. And taxing sex workers really ramped up through the 1500s.
Great, thank you. I believe as you were discussing the taverns, the question came up, in this context, does the term tavern encompass any bars or restaurants, or are there other establishments serving alcohol or food that may have gone by other names and not been considered taverns?
So that is an interesting and tricky question. So the reason why I talk a lot about innkeepers as well as tavern keepers is because we have in the census, the commercial census as well as the residential census, places that are rented or owned and used as a tavern. That is the phrase that you find in the census. So you'll have households, 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 and then a building that was used for a tavern, no one lives there. And then you continue with buildings that are used as houses. But also there were households run by tavern keepers who are described as the tavern keeper at the Inn of the Rooster, right? So it's clear that there were some inns that had taverns where they served alcohol and food. There are lovely records of Florentine artists, Michelangelo as well as others, who would get together for lunch at taverns through the early 1500s. And there are even menus of what they ate. Really wonderful glimpses into the lives of people going out for lunch with colleagues, with other people. And of course, there are also sort of weird kind of house taverns where someone is just opening up their house, very small usually, and serving alcohol to people who stop in for a drink. There's a lot of flexibility here, but we were following the census and looking for specific places that had names as taverns, if that makes sense. So they would be used as a tavern, and it would be the Buco or the Malvagia or the Tavern of the Cow. Yeah.
Okay. Was there an association between sex work and other professions that may have been considered less respectable back then, but are socially acceptable now? As an example, theater performers, musicians, etc.
Yes. Dancing masters. You would never expect that the National Ballet of Canada might be a front for a brothel, but Florentines did. Interestingly, though, those dancing masters were male, not female. And so there, as we move into the late 1500s and the 1600s, there's great suspicion that dancing schools in Florence are just a place to go drink wine and meet sex workers, male and female. Yes, definitely in later centuries, there are questions about actors and actresses, ballerinas as well. Laundresses too. So Mona Benedetta and Mona Sandra, historians have pointed to the fact that they dealt with very intimate things by washing clothes and sheets. And because they had to come into houses to pick up the laundry, they might encounter people in a very domestic space, close to beds. And in this time period, so business was done in a bedroom. It was just another room. Documents are notarized in someone's bedroom, and that is written into the document. It was a place where you could have meetings as well as sleep and have sex. So there are a whole bunch of, particularly for women, professions that are kind of intimate, are kind of suspect to early moderns, and are seen as just a couple steps away from actual sex work.
All right. We have a question here from Deborah. What was the life expectancy of men and women in the 1500s? Are we aware if the life expectancy was lower for sex workers?
So, the way it were, how to put it. So the first year of life was the first big hurdle, right? An infant that lived through the first year of life had already crossed the threshold. There was a very high infant mortality rate. If you could then get to the age of 20, and you were male, you had bypassed another huge hurdle. So a lot of children die before either of diseases or accidents or just doing foolish things, falling into the river and not knowing how to swim. You had crossed another hurdle, and then you were sort of into adulthood. Women who survived childbirth, repeated childbirth, tended to live to a ripe old age. And that could be anything from 50 to 60 to 80. Women tended to outlive their husbands if they survived childbirth. And it can be difficult to say an average age, but it was rare, very rare, to find in your neighborhood people who were in their 70s or 80s, whereas it's quite comparatively common now. So yeah, I would say that if we had to average, it would be for a woman who survived childbirth in the 40s or 50s. Sex workers, it's a lot harder because we don't always know what happens to them outside of the documents that we have. We might see a moment in time through a document, through a list of sex workers, and then they're gone to us, and we just don't know what happened to them. But it was surely a hard profession.
Okay. The next one we have from Julia. Do we know how much the noble versus lower class sex worker charged?
No, but we need to think about it in a little bit of a different way. So charging is a lower class thing. And they undoubtedly did. There's no question about that. But it was more at the noble level or a courtesan level, more of a firm friend, amico fermo. So our sex workers would talk about so-and-so is a firm friend. She has slept with them for many years or all through last winter. And he comes to see her every few days, and he might bring food, or he might give her a pair of shoes, or he sends someone with some coins. That friendship and, of course, payment is seen in different ways in documents. So we start to see support rather than fees or payment at the upper level, at the more expensive level, shall we say, of sex workers. At the lower level, we could see something similar. It might be company or sex in exchange for a dinner, or sometimes it is coins, sometimes it's sort of a barter system. It can be hard to know for sure, but it is very flexible.
Okay. The next one we have from Victor. Was there a minimum age requirement to get a license in Florence? What was the city process, if there was any?
So there was absolutely a process. The magistrates that I talked about who regulated sex work were elected Sorry, no, they were appointed. They were actually picked out of a bag of potential names, potential magistrates every 6 months. And so they served for 6 months. And the office, so where they would have all their books, their staff, where you would go to be licensed, was actually quite close to the Florentine Cathedral. So if you've been there, you were only a couple minutes walk away from Sex Work Central and from the site of the public brothel in Florence, where some sex workers lived who didn't work out of their households. And so a sex worker who wanted to live in the city would go. She would say, hello, I am Orsolina from Bologna. I would like to be registered. Here are my 15 lire for a 3-month license. And I would like to pay the extra enormous fee for not having to live in the 18 permitted streets. And also, I'd like to work during the nighttime, not just during the daytime. So I will pay another fee on top of that. And actually, I have a lot of money, so I'd like to dress however I want. I don't want to have to wear the yellow ribbon or the yellow veil that denotes I'm a sex worker. I'd like to just wear my usual clothes. So here's even more money for that license. There were a whole bunch of different license or exemption certificates that one could buy from these magistrates. And so when I said taxing sex workers, this is what I meant. And of course, all of those licenses or exemptions had to be renewed frequently. So that's where you would go, not far from the cathedral, to do all the paperwork and pay your fees.
Interesting. You know what? I'm sure we can keep the conversation going, but I'll wrap it up with one last question. To return to the first illustration, could a common sex worker become a noble sex worker? Say if she accumulated wealth or had a noble guarantor, would that be solely based on her status at birth?
So it was possible with a lot of skill. So there are different sort of ways of thinking about success for sex workers. Quite often it is having enough money to buy your home, or having enough money to send a child to school, or having enough money so that your daughter doesn't have to be a sex worker, or having enough money to set your daughter up as a noble sex worker, or just retiring to a convent. So those are all visions of success. And it usually required having an amico fermo, a close, firm friend who would support you, who would protect you, who would give you the money necessary or set you up in secure surroundings. It was definitely possible for women coming from common background to mingle with men of noble standing. They usually had extra skills, not just beauty or luck. So Veronica Franco, the poet, is a good example. Tulia d'Aragona, although she claimed she was the illegitimate daughter of a cardinal, was never quite proven. These women were seen as courtesans and a cut above the rest, but they came from common stock. Sadly, Veronica Franco sort of rose and then fell. She ended her life in poverty. But when we think about success, we should probably think about retirement to the convent or owning your own home, or even just getting out of the field, not being a procuress in old age.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for answering all the questions, Professor DeSilva. I'm sure, like I said, we could continue the evening long, but unfortunately, we have to cut it off here. With that, I will hand it over to Alex to bring it home.
I just want to say, on behalf of the Woodsworth College Alumni Association, I'd like to express our utmost gratitude to Professor DeSilva. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights. This was a wonderful presentation, and I found it really fascinating. I'm sure everyone watching it felt the same way. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. We also want to thank Carolyn Peralta. She assists us with everything we do, and I mean, this organization couldn't run without her and her help and her time and her kindness and generosity with our questions. So thank you so much, Caroline. I want to thank our alumni and audience for attending and engaging in the discussion. It really helps when this is a partnership between us and we work together. And I really love the questions. They were great questions. They really helped really helped with the presentation and getting along, and it was a pleasure to read it. If this is your first time at one of our events, we hope you'll join us again. Please check out the Woodsworth College website for information on future events. And in particular, we want to invite you to join us for the University of Toronto Varsity Blues basketball game at Gold Ring from our private viewing gallery in January. It's the perfect chance to reconnect with fellow alumni and show the Varsity Blues some love. Watch out for that e-invite and register online as spots are limited. Finally, sorry, it's a big speech to go through here. Woodsworth College is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. We hope you will consider making a gift to support Woodsworth College students as they pursue their dreams of attaining a university education. Your donation will contribute to a brighter and more prosperous future for all. If you are interested in making a donation online, you can do so by clicking the link shared in the chat. I've been spending a lot of time talking to Woodsworth students this last semester, and I've been away from the university for a while, and it really does make a difference to their lives and their studies. And every donation, no matter how small, it really does have an impact. So whatever you can give, we're just incredibly grateful. It really will, make students' lives easier. And before saying goodbye, I would like to mention that you'll see a short survey on your screen, and it would be much appreciated if you could take a minute to complete it. We would love to hear from you to better tailor our future events. This concludes our evening. Thanks, everyone, and good night.